Hello and welcome to DOZ Monologues, hosted by Eturuvie Erebor. DOZ Monologues, also known as DOZ Chronicles Audio Stories, aims to educate, inspire, and drive societal change. All stories are written and narrated by Eturuvie Erebor, and all rights are reserved, including the right of reproduction in whole or in part in any form. This is episode 12, titled A Tale of Two Wives. If you're listening on YouTube, please subscribe, like, and share. Thank you. A Tale of Two Wives. This is a tale of two wives, Mrs. Ekanem and Mrs. Archibong. Both women shared many commonalities. They were both married. They were both from Uyo. They were both in the same trade and lived in the same neighbourhood. As a matter of fact, they lived next door to one another. While they shared some commonalities, they also had some differences. Mrs. Ekanem was a young woman in her late 20s, and her marriage was only 3 years old. She was the mother of one, a 3-year-old daughter. Mrs. Archibong, on the other hand, was a woman in her early 50s who had been married for 25 years, and her 2 children, both males, were already out of the nest. Another difference between the two women was their husbands. Mrs. Ekanem's husband, a civil engineer in his early 30s, refused to take up employment, instead becoming a contractor with no steady income. He was constantly pursuing government contracts, but never secured any. His instability meant that as a family, they faced significant challenges. Fortunately for him, he had inherited the house from his late father, or they probably would have been out on the streets. Mr. Archibong, on the other hand, was a very successful architect in his late 50s who had spent the first 20 years of his career in stable employment, which had allowed him to grow financially. He was now in business for himself, leveraging the contacts he had made while he was employed, and as such, the jobs kept coming, as did the money. His beautiful home was not an inheritance, but one he built after many years of hard work. It stood out as the best on the street and as a testament to his mastery of his profession as an architect. I became acquainted with both women when I moved back to Uyo from Lagos, a few months after retiring from my job as a teacher at Queen's College. My husband, who passed away, was a distinguished son of Uyo. He was the first person from the state to achieve the rank of Major General in the Nigerian Army. He held this position until his retirement 5 years ago, and unfortunately died a few months later. Uyo was not a place I had visited frequently during my younger years. I grew up in Lagos, got married there, and raised my children in the city. We occasionally returned to Uyo, where we even built our retirement home, but we never stayed for long. As a result, I knew very little about the neighbors before moving back to live in Uyo. When I moved to Uyo, it wasn't long before I became acquainted with both families. They lived across the street from my home, and you couldn't possibly miss them. Well, I didn't. How could I? The morning after I arrived home, I woke up to the smell of freshly baked bread and pastries wafting through the window. I lay in bed wondering about the aroma, which was already making me very hungry. I was tempted to call Idara, the young lady in her early 20s who had come to live with me and look after my home. But as I thought to call her, it dawned on me that the aroma couldn't be coming from my own kitchen. Idara and I had been very busy the day before when I arrived. We cleaned the house and set things up. There had been no time to go shopping for food items, so there wasn't any food to cook, let alone flour and other ingredients for baking. I got out of bed and opened my bedroom door, calling out to Idara, who immediately appeared with a cup of herbal tea and a bright smile. "Good morning, ma'am," she said, handing me the cup, which I collected with a smile as I proceeded to the balcony outside my bedroom, which overlooked the front gate and the street. The smell of baked goods became stronger as I opened the sliding glass doors and stepped outside. I was pretty shocked to see a small crowd outside the two houses on the other side of the street. "Idara, what's that crowd?" I asked. "What's going on over there?" Idara was very observant and chatty, and I knew that even though we had only arrived the day before, she would either already know or very quickly find out whatever was going on in the neighborhood. She stepped out and stood next to me. "I understand that Mrs. Ekanem and Mrs. Archibong bake bread and pastries every morning," which explains the crowd. "These people are waiting for their turn to make a purchase. Some are buying for personal consumption, while others are buying to resell in their shops and supermarkets." As we had no food in the house, I gave Idara some money and asked her to go across and get us some bread and pastries. They were absolutely delicious. That's how I became acquainted with the businesses of Mrs. Ekanem and Mrs. Archibong. But at the time, I had yet to meet both women in person. Each morning, I would sit on my bedroom balcony, observing the happenings over a cup of tea, accompanied by freshly baked bread and other pastries that Idara had bought. With time on my hands, I would often spend several hours on the balcony observing the activities. With the information Idara shared with me during her interactions with domestic staff in other houses, I began to piece together a picture of Mrs. Ekanem and Mrs. Archibong. Mrs. Ekanem was new to the business and with fewer customers, as was evidenced by the shorter queues in front of her home in the mornings, in comparison to Mrs. Archibong, who not only had a larger queue in front of her home in the mornings, but whose customers seemed to come and go all through the day. I observed that often those queuing in front of Mrs. Ekanem's home would quickly move and join the queue in front of Mrs. Archibong's home. Idara also would say things like, "Mrs. Ekanem ran out, so I bought from Mrs. Archibong," or "Mrs. Ekanem didn't bake today, so I bought from Mrs. Archibong." Mrs. Ekanem ran her business like one runs a hobby. She was inconsistent, baking some days and not baking others. She was unreliable, often disappointing her customers, which I found sad. I had believed she had the potential to grow her business and match the success of her neighbor, Mrs. Archibong, whose business was flourishing. I observed Mrs. Ekanem for several days as she walked her daughter to the nursery school down the road and later went to pick her up. She traveled everywhere on foot or by public transport, in contrast to her neighbor, Mrs. Archibong, who had a collection of luxury vehicles at her disposal, in addition to the vans she used for her business. I tried to decipher what kind of woman she was and why she didn't take her business seriously. It was clear that money could be made from the business. One only had to look at Mrs. Archibong to know that. And Mrs. Ekanem clearly needed money. So why wasn't she striving to grow her business, especially as the customers were there, daily demanding her goods? I didn't have to wonder too long, because at the end of the 4th week of my moving into the area, Mr. and Mrs. Archibong came to visit me. "Welcome to Uyo," Mr. Archibong said cheerfully. "It's great to have you in this neighborhood. Your house has been vacant for far too many years." I beamed with gratitude. "Thank you so much, sir." I waved to him and his wife, encouraging them to take a seat in the wrought iron chairs in the front garden, where Idara had kindly prepared some refreshments for us. It feels great to be back home after spending so many years in Lagos. I am Ofisong, retired teacher. With warm smiles, the couple took turns extending their hands, each clasping mine firmly as we exchanged greetings. "We are Mr. and Mrs Archibong," Mr. Archibong said, pointing to their magnificent home across the street. "That's our home. We are caterers." I frowned slightly as we all sat down, wondering why he had introduced himself and his wife as caterers. I had heard he was an architect, but I did not pursue the matter. "Everyone in the area knows what your wife does for a living. The smell of her bread and pastries fills the air early in the morning, even before we get out of bed." They both laughed, and I turned to Mrs. Archibong. "Your bread and pastries are delicious. How long have you been baking?" "I started 25 years ago, when my husband and I were newly married." "That's a long time," I said. "Yes, it is," she agreed. "It sometimes doesn't feel that long." "It feels like just yesterday when you asked me for money to start," Mr. Archibong said to his wife. "I am still in awe of how far we've come since those early days." "It appears you are very much a part of your wife's business," I said. "Oh yes," he said, and turned to his wife, who flashed him a smile. "When we were newly married, my wife came to me and said she was bored sitting at home all day long, doing nothing but waiting for my return from work in the evenings. She said she wanted to start a business that would allow her to earn even while she was home looking after the children we would have. She cooked and baked well, having learned from her mother, so we decided she should start baking in our kitchen and taking it out to sell. In the early days, she had no customers coming to her, unlike now. She had to deliver the baked goods to customers, and since we didn't own a vehicle, it was pretty tough, especially when she was pregnant with our first child. But I encouraged her and helped her as much as I could, particularly in the evenings when I closed from work. Although the income was small, I saw the potential and invested more money in the business. Today we have diversified. My wife takes contracts to cater for parties and weddings. She has a massive, fully equipped commercial kitchen and employs several staff. And this is in addition to having apprentices. I am an architect, and a few years ago I left my long-standing job to start my own practice. I can tell you that I took that risk, knowing that even if it takes me a few years to grow my architectural firm, our lifestyle won't take a hit because of my wife's business. It has grown exponentially through the years, just as I envisioned. Even if I stop working altogether, my investment in my wife's business is enough to feed me. After Mr. and Mrs. Archibong left, I sat in my garden, reflecting on our conversation. It was easy to understand why Mrs. Archibong's business was thriving. Her husband actively supported her, investing time and money to ensure its success. In fact, he introduced himself in relation to his wife's profession, which spoke volumes about his commitment. Although he was an architect, he identified more with her trade, indicating his strong support. Some might attribute her success to the current boom in the industry. Still, from what he shared, it was clear he had encouraged and supported her, even during the early days when the business was just starting, believing that it would one day reach its current level of success. The week after the Archibongs visited me, I received a visit from Mr. Ekanem. It wasn't a visit from both Mr. and Mrs. Ekanem. Mr. Ekanem came by himself to welcome me to the neighborhood. He did not bring his wife with him. "Good evening, madam." He stood up and greeted me with a smile the moment I stepped out onto the veranda in front of the main living room. "I am Obot Ekanem, Engineer Obot Ekanem, your neighbor." Like Mr. Archibong had done, he gestured to his house across the street, which, in contrast to the Archibongs, was conservative. Although built in a different era, it was nonetheless equally impressive. With a warm smile, I held out my hands to him. "Mr. Ekanem, what a pleasure to finally meet you," I said as we shook hands. "Welcome back to Uyo," he said as we both sat. "My dad greatly admired your husband. We all did, and it is wonderful to have you back home amongst us." "Thank you so much, Mr. Ekanem," I said. "It was very kind of you to come over and introduce yourself." "It's the least I can do when one of us comes home. My wife would have joined me, but she's busy cooking at home. I asked her to prepare a special meal for you, and she should be arriving any moment now." "Oh?" I was a bit surprised by that. "You shouldn't have gone to so much trouble." He waved his hand dismissively. "It's not trouble at all. She loves cooking and baking. She studied catering and hotel management at the Polytechnic in Eket, so she should put her skills to good use. My father taught me to be hospitable, and knowing how much he respected your late husband, I'm sure he would have wanted me to welcome you home with a good meal." "Thank you for your hospitality and generosity," I said, smiling at him. "I also know a little about your wife, specifically her baking. She is excellent at it. I have had the pleasure of trying her pastries." "Oh, that," he scoffed. "Don't mind her. She's trying to run a business from home, but I've told her several times that it's a waste of time and unprofessional to do so in our neighborhood. She's becoming a nuisance, just like Mrs. Archibong. This is a residential area, not a commercial one, yet every morning a long line of people forms outside Mrs. Archibong's house to buy her pastries. It's defacing what used to be an upscale community for upper middle class families. When I married my wife, I promised her a substantial sum of money to help launch her business properly. This plan included renting a shop in a mall or commercial area, hiring staff, acquiring a delivery van, and ensuring the success of her business. As soon as she moved in and saw the customers at Mrs. Archibong's, she grew impatient. She wanted a share of the business for herself, so she started baking with the little money she had, using the kitchen oven. Now she is teaming up with Mrs. Archibong, that illiterate and classless woman, to tarnish the neighborhood. I inherited that house from my father, who was a chief judge in this state many years ago. I bet he never imagined that one day people will be standing outside his house waiting to buy baked goods." "I understand your point, Mr. Ekanem, and I am confident that once you provide your wife with the funds she needs to relocate her business to a commercial area, she will indeed do so." Yes, he said, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "I have been pursuing some significant contracts for a while now. Contracts worth hundreds of millions of naira. This will provide her with substantial capital to properly launch her business. I believe in conducting things decently. I come from an upper middle class Nigerian family. While things may be a bit challenging right now, that's no excuse for me to forget my background or act like the Archibongs. Mr. Archibong has done well for himself over the years, but who is his father? He wasn't born into the same type of home that I was, nor did he have my upbringing. That's why he has turned this elite neighborhood into a marketplace." "It's true that Mr. Archibong has succeeded," I said. He and his wife visited me a few days ago, and I enjoyed learning about how they started their catering business. Ah, yes, he said, rolling his eyes. Mr. Archibong can't resist sharing that story everywhere he goes. Did he introduce himself as a caterer? I smiled and said, actually, he did. He said, we are caterers. Just imagine, he scoffed. An architect has lowered himself to being a caterer. This is what happens when a man marries a woman with no education. She drags him down to her level. The woman is nothing but an illiterate market vendor, and Mr. Archibong married her because he lacks class. I always tell my wife how lucky she is to have married me. The only reason I married her was that she was pregnant and because my father had passed away. I am a trained engineer educated at Imperial College, a prestigious university in the United Kingdom. There's no way my father would have allowed me to marry a woman who studied catering and hotel management at a small polytechnic. But even then, she is still better than Mrs. Archibong, who didn't even finish secondary school. I believe catering and hotel management is an excellent course, and she can excel in it. She has a talent for baking and already has customers. So, what customers? Those are Mrs. Archibong's customers. I keep telling my wife not to stress herself over them. When she scales up her business, she will attract a significant amount of customers. Some mornings she wakes up early to bake, and I ask, what for? How much are you really making from selling just a few pastries? I tell her to get some rest and not worry about the business right now. I'll soon set her up properly. He had been married to his wife for 3 years, but had not yet been able to properly establish her in business, as he had promised. I opened my mouth to speak, but closed it again as Idara led Mrs. Ekanem, who was carrying a large picnic basket, onto the veranda. Mrs. Ekanem was a timid woman. I could instantly tell that although she had more formal education than Mrs. Archibong, she lacked the self-confidence of the other woman, especially standing next to her very proud and haughty husband. She set down the food under her husband's supervision, as he felt the need to guide her on where and how to place it. Once she had finished, she welcomed me to Uyo and hurriedly left, mentioning that she needed to return home to her young daughter. I didn't have a chance to talk to her that day, but the following evening, when she returned to pick up her dishes, we had a conversation. Even though her husband was absent, she remained very timid. However, I managed to extract some information from her to better understand her situation. I really enjoyed your pastries, I said to her, hoping to start a friendly conversation. Idara goes out every morning to stand in line for our bread rolls and pastries. It's unfortunate that we can't always buy from you, and most of the time we end up having to queue for Mrs. Archibong instead. She smiled but did not look up at me, choosing instead to focus on her hands. I apologize for that, ma'am, she said. Several people have complained about my inconsistency, and I will make an effort to be more consistent in the future. The thing is, I have a few challenges. For instance, my oven is small, so my baking options are limited and my goods run out quickly. How long have you been baking? I asked. It has been almost 3 years, she replied. The venture began a few months after I moved in with my husband, following our wedding. That's a reasonable amount of time. Have you made money from your business? Can't you save for a larger oven? I asked. I am capable of saving money, and I do. Recently, I secured a contract for a birthday party, which generated a good profit. I could have used that money to buy a bigger oven, But whenever I have a substantial amount saved, my husband takes it from me. Takes it from you? I asked. Why? He states that he needs cash flow for the contract he is pursuing. To consistently meet with government officials, he must fuel his car, have his suits professionally cleaned, and occasionally provide a bribe or take people out for lunch. I nodded as I began to understand Mrs. Ekanem's marriage better. All these things cost money, and he isn't making money yet, is he? No, she shook her head. He isn't making any money. He has been pursuing this contract since before our wedding, and soon he will secure them, earning millions. When that happens, he will give me a portion of the money to help me get started properly. For now, I bake when I can, but most days he asks me not to, as the income is meager anyway. I rested my hand under my chin as I examined her closely. Mr. and Mrs. Ekanem were turning out to be quite an interesting pair. How do you manage to pay your bills if your husband hasn't secured the contracts he's pursuing and your business is inconsistent? She shrugged. I manage the feeding and our daughter's school fees using money I save from the business. Whatever remains after he's taking what he needs, I stated. She nodded and looked up at me with a small smile. Yes. But before that, how were you living? From what you said, you didn't start your business until after you had been married for some time. I hoped she wouldn't see me as a nosy neighbor. I asked only because I considered her like a daughter, and the teacher in me, who had spent years probing students to understand the reasons behind their behavioral issues, couldn't let me rest until I figured out what motivated Mrs. Ekanem. Yes, that's correct, she said. When we were first married, we lived off the cash gifts we were given at our wedding. Once that was done, he would go to his mother and ask her for money. Her husband left her well provided for, and she doesn't need much to sustain herself. But I felt uncomfortable, so I decided to start baking and selling. I saw Mrs. Archibong do it daily and knew she didn't have my formal training in catering. There was a ready market, so I started. Even though he had spoken of setting me up when his millions came in, I knew we had to survive in the interim, and this was how I knew to get us through the current difficult season. After Mrs. Ekanem left, I remained seated, deep in thought as I compared the two women. Initially, I had thought that Mrs. Ekanem was a younger version of Mrs. Archibong, and that in about 10 years she will be in the same position as Mrs. Archibong. However, I realized that this would never happen, especially considering the kind of man she was married to. The lives and destinies of both women were daily rising or falling based on the man they had chosen to spend their lives with. Mrs. Archibong was not as educated as Mrs. Ekanem, and she lacked the formal training that Mrs. Ekanem had in her field. But no one would know it by looking at her. She had married a man who had over the years encouraged and supported her, and here she was with a thriving business. Mrs. Ekanem, on the other hand, had married a man who was stuck in the past, a man who did not realize that his father was dead and was no longer a chief judge. He couldn't see that his family was living in poverty, as he constantly spoke of the upper class family he was born into. He failed to realize that Nigeria had become so impoverished that what was once a residential area was now turning into a commercial one, as people had to set up small businesses at home just to survive. He dreamed of achieving great things, yet he harbored a clear disdain for the smaller aspects of life. He failed to realize that all great accomplishments start from small beginnings. Proud and arrogant, he insulted the Archibongs, who who were far superior to him and from whom he could have learned valuable lessons about greatness if only he had been wise. He also insulted his wife's business, the very business that the family relied on, and did nothing to help it grow. In fact, he hindered its progress by preventing her from baking for her customers and taking away the money she could have used to expand the trade. No, Mrs. Ekanem was unlikely to get very far with a husband like that. She should have had more leverage than Mrs. Archibong, being younger, more educated, and with more energy to work. But her choice of a husband meant she would never see her business at the stage that Mrs. Archibong's business had reached. The end. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of episode 12 of DOZ Monologues. DOZ Monologues will return next week with another episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave your comments and subscribe, like, and share if listening on YouTube. To contact me, please visit my website eturuvie.erebor.com or email me at eturuvie@eturuvieerebor.com. I invite all story lovers to explore my novels and novellas available on Amazon and Google Books. For audiobook enthusiasts, they are also on Audible. Thank you for listening. I am your favorite storyteller, Eturuvie Erebor, and I'll be here next Friday with another story.